Welcome to the 11th tutorial of my Tableau Server Client series. This series is dedicated to showcasing how to use Tableau Server Client to automate various tasks. In this video, I will walk you through the process of generating a report containing important details on each of your users' favorites maintained on your Tableau server. I'll show you how to query your Tableau server for information on each favorite using Tableau Server Client and subsequently write that information to an Excel workbook. Before jumping into the coding aspect of this video, allow me to speak to this type of report's use cases. A favorites report allows you to understand what your Tableau server looks like in terms of favorited items. It allows you to answer questions like, which pieces of content has each user favorited? Are the favorited items projects, workbooks, data sources, flows, or a combination of those types of items? When was each favorite created? Additionally, it allows you to answer questions like, which pieces of content are highly favorited? Is content being highly favorited a function of user onboarding? This can happen when user onboarding includes favoriting specific pieces of content relevant to each user and those users like them. Suppose the user belongs to the North America sales team. It would make sense that the user be able to quickly navigate to content relevant to them using their favorites menu. Having briefly discussed the use cases, I will now jump over to Visual Studio Code to begin writing a script to generate a report on the user favorites maintained on my Tableau server. For this example, I am going to send a request to my Tableau server to provide a list of all favorites existing on the server. After retrieving that list of favorite objects, I will start by creating a simple report that provides important details on each favorite. I will then further develop the structure and contents of this report by incorporating what you learned in my video on generating a user's report to include each favorite owner's details within the report. At the end of this walkthrough, I will show you how to write the report to an Excel file for reporting and dissemination purposes. The first step I need to take is to configure my connection to the Tableau server. If you are unfamiliar with how to configure a connection to your Tableau server for authentication purposes, please watch video 2 of this series. In that video, I walk through connecting to Tableau server for the first time. I will also place the link to the video in the comments section. After configuring the connection details, I can begin working towards a solution that will generate the desired favorites reports. I need to use the Tableau Server Client object I configured in the first code block to sign in. I have went ahead and started off the second code block by doing just that. I'm using a context manager to ensure I stay signed in while attempting to access information on my Tableau server. Additionally, this ensures that I also sign out each time. Alright, so to get started, let's go ahead and run this first block that's responsible for creating my Tableau Server Client object. The next step is to sign in. And while signed in, let's go ahead and gather a list of user objects. So I'm going to say users is equal to user for user in tsc.pager server.users. What I want to do is let me just scroll down quickly. And then we'll go ahead and run this. So what is this doing is it's gathering a list of user objects maintained on my server using the user's endpoint. Let's go ahead and create a block down here to do some whiteboard work and take a look at that users list. All right, so we have two user objects corresponding to two users on my server. Let's go ahead and look at the attributes that are maintained for each. And to do that, I need to access an individual user to see those attributes. So we have quite a few attributes. The important one that I want to look at is actually the favorites. That's the whole point of this report, is we need to generate a report containing the favorites for each user. Along with the favorites, we'll need things like email, full name, site role, and the ID, of course. Okay, so we have these attributes, and you'll notice that the favorites, it's unpopulated, right? It says none. So this could be deceiving. You could think, well, this user doesn't have any favorites. But in the case of the Tableau Server Client and the API, what is actually occurring here is upon initial retrieval of a user object, the favorites aren't populated, so you actually have to call the favorite method, so populate favorites method. So let's go ahead and do that now. Just as an example, I'm going to say users. Let's just do server.users.populate favorites. And I'm going to pass in the first user item, right? So the first user in that list of user objects. So I'm going to just say 0 and do that. And then let's just look at this exact same. So I'm going to rerun this block of code, haven't changed anything. And you're going to notice that the favorites value is populated. All right, so let's just go ahead and zoom into that. All right, so our favorites are populated now. What you see here is a dictionary containing a series of keys and values. The keys are the content types, so data sources, flows, projects, metrics, views, workbooks. Those are the types of content that can be favorited by a user. the values are list of corresponding favorited items, right? So here, let's just do data sources. Here are the favorited data sources by this user. There's 3 of them. What I want to do here is I want to capture all of this information in a data frame. So for each user, I want to ensure that I'm able to showcase, hey, this user has these favorites, this user has these favorites, and so forth. So what I'm going to do here is to do that for each user. I obviously can't access them one at a time like this. What I'll do is I'll actually create a loop, right? So let's just go ahead and write this out. Gather all user favorites across each category type. So let's just say, for example, workbooks, data sources, flows, etc. And to do that, just do a loop for user and users. So I'm going to iterate through my list of user objects. And user by user, I'm going to populate their favorites. So I'm going to call populate favorites method so that those favorites are populated and that I can access that information. So let's just put user in here. Now, the next few steps, they may not make sense at first, but the idea here is that we're going to iterate through each user, extract their favorite information, place that in a data frame. And for each of those categories, we're going to create individual data frames. So I'm going to go category by category. So for each user, I'm going to go user 1, category 1, user 1, category 2, user 1, category 3, and so forth. And those category 1, 2, and 3, those are like workbooks, data sources, flows, right? The category type of favorites. And then again, I'm going to append all of those into a list of data frames. And to create my favorites report, I'm just going to concatenate those data frames. But what I want to do, and that might really help you if you're running this code and you have a server that has hundreds, if not thousands of users, I want to make sure that for each user, when I'm attempting to extract their favorites information, that I'm actually checking first to see if the list of items corresponding to that category type or favorite type is empty. And if it is, I'm going to skip it. I'm not going to create an empty data frame, append an empty data frame, right? So how am I going to do that? Let's just go ahead and say favorite categories. Say category for category in user.favorites.keys. And what is user.favorites.keys? Well, if we look at this users.favorites.keys, that is just going to be the favorite types, right? So we have data sources, flows, projects, metrics, views, and workbooks. And this is going to be standard across every user. Every user is going to have these values. But the difference from user to user is going to be, well, for each of these keys, what are the values? Is it an empty list or is it a list populated with, say, data source objects, flow objects, project objects, and so forth? We want to avoid making empty data frames for those categories that the user has no favorites for. So I'm going to do if user.favorites and then category. So I'm going to check if the list is empty because I know about the structure, right? It's a dictionary of a series of key and value pairs, and the values are always going to be a list. I can use this method just to see if the list is empty. If user.favorites category. So in this case, this could be data sources. If the data sources list for the user is empty, then do not consider that a favorite category. This may make more sense here in a moment when we start creating data frames for each category. Okay, so for category and favorite categories, let's just say favorite categories. We're going to say category favorites. And we're going to create a data frame. And this data frame, I'm just going to do two keyword arguments. I'm going to say data is equal to user.favorites category. And then I will say columns equals favorites. What this is going to do is it's going to create an individual data frame with the column. So there's going to be one column that's going to be called favorites or named favorites. And the data is going to take the values from the list. So let's just say, for example, here, let's do data sources. It's going to take these objects and represent these as rows in a column called favorites. So what I could expect, let's just imagine that the first category in this loop is data sources. What I would expect is a data frame to be created that has a column called favorites, and captured within that column are 3 data sources, so 3 rows. All right, let's keep going. In this next step, I'm going to add to this data frame. So currently So if I run this right now, let's just go ahead and run this again and look at our category favorites, the most recent category favorites object created as a result of this looping. So we see that we have a data frame, the column is favorites, and then we have a series of workbook favorites. These are workbook objects. Now, if I were to look at these, so if I say category, let's just say favorite, series, and let's just take the first one, and then _dict. If I access the attributes maintained for each of these workbooks, what you'll see is I have several. So for starters, what I want to do here is for my favorites report, I want to extract a specific set of attributes for each favorite type. So workbooks, data sources, projects, flows, etc. What I want to do is I want to extract the favorite ID. So the ID associated with each favorite, the favorite name. So the name associated with each favorite. So in this case, the name is here. So this one's Superstore. The ID is here. So I want to extract those for each favorite. I want to extract the category title. So what is the category title? The category is going to be, in this case, what we saw here is we're looking at a workbooks data frame. So the category, I want it to be workbooks. And why would I want to extract this or create a column that captures this? Well, I want to be able to, in my report, I want to distinguish one favorite type from another. Like I want to be able to say, hey, this user has 5 workbook favorites. This user has 5 data source favorites, and so forth. And that's going to be super important answering very specific questions row by row, right? We're going to be able to look one row at a time. We're going to say, hey, this is a workbook favorite or a data source favorite very quickly. So I'm going to derive that attribute or that column based on the category that we're currently looping through, right? And creating a data frame for. Okay. So I also want the project ID if there is a project ID. So in this case for workbooks, there is a project ID attribute. I want the project name. Let's see, where's project name? Here it is. So it's in the samples folder. Let's also get the user ID associated with this favorite. So because we're looping through users, right? So this whole process started out with iterating through user objects. Well, that information is accessible to us within each looping phase, right? So for each iteration, so let's just say we're on our first iteration, I'm iterating through the first user, or I'm on the first user and I'm looking at its attributes. Well, I have all of those attributes available to me. So what I want to pull out of here is I want to pull out their ID. I want to pull out their full name, their email address, and their site role. And for me, I'm going to name those things a little bit differently, just because some of these attributes, whenever you look at them, how they're maintained in the actual object that's returned to you using the API Tableau Server Client, they're a little bit different than the way they're named on the front end. So I'm going to use the front end names, the names that you would see on the front end of your Tableau server. All right, let's go ahead and get started doing that. And to do this, I'm just going to alter the data frame. So in this case, our first data frame, we're going to be altering something like this. All right, so our data frames that are created, let me get this back up here. So we have this data frame. I'm going to be pulling out those attributes that I just mentioned for each row in the data frame or each object. Okay, so I'm going to say category favorites. I'm going to augment this data frame to include those additional columns we just spoke about. I'm going to say category favorites. Dot assign. I'm going to go through a series of assignments. So I'm going to create columns using Lambda functions. Let's go ahead and get started doing that. So I'm going to say favorites ID is equal to category favorites. Favorites. So I'm in the column favorite. I'm traversing the rows in the column favorites, the only column that's currently in there. And I'll say dot apply lambda. And what are we going to do? We're going to say for each favorite, extract the ID value. So this favorite could be a workbook ID, it could be a data source ID, it could be a flow ID. It doesn't matter because I'm just operating on the row and extracting this attribute regardless of which object type it is or which favorite type it is. That's how this is working. And because each of these objects, each of these favorite types share this attribute, we're not going to have an issue, right? It's going to say, okay, give me the ID for this favorite captured within this row. All right, the next one, let's go ahead and do favorite name is equal to category, favorites. Could have just copied and pasted this. Let's do lambda favorites and favorite.name. So extract the name attribute for each favorite. So again, we're just going row by row and applying this. So extract the name from each of those objects. So the attribute name. The next thing I want to do is I want to actually, let's go ahead and capture the category title. So I'm going to say favorite category. I want to say category title. I'm talking about, let's capture the favorite type and let's put that in title case. And what is this going to do? So it's going to do something like, let's just do for key in favorite categories, print key.title, right? So it's going to do that, right? As opposed to having that, right? So I'm obsessed with composable about this. We're going to have it in uppercase for the first initial character. That's why I'm doing that. So I'm going to create a column that tags each row with the type of favorite it is. Is it a data source favorite? Is it a flow favorite? Is it a workbook favorite? And so forth. All right. So the next two attributes I'm going to capture are going to be the project ID and project name. Some of these favorite types do not have a project ID and project name attributes. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use get attribute to first try to get that attribute, and if it doesn't exist, I'm going to put a default value of not applicable. So let's go ahead and do that now. So favorite project ID is equal to category favorites, and let's say dot apply lambda, say favorites, and for each of these favorites, I'm going to use get. Let's get the project ID attribute if it exists. If it doesn't exist, let's just say not applicable. What I'll do here is I'm going to copy and paste this instead of enjoying that typing exercise again. All right, so let's also change this out for project name. And the next series of attributes. So we already have the user information available to us because what are we doing? We're iterating on user objects that we pulled down from our server, right? So we use this method here. We use a list comprehension to access our user's endpoint on our server to create a list of user objects. And that's what we're iterating through, right? We're populating their favorites. We're creating a data frame containing the favorites associated with each favorite type, so workbooks, data sources, etc. And as a result of iterating through the user objects, we have access to each of those attributes for each object. So I'm going to just be able to say user ID is equal to user.id, user display name is equal to user.fullname, user email address is equal to user.email, and user site role is equal to user.site role. All right, and I'm not just making this stuff up, right? Most of these I have memorized at this point in time, but if I just go users and I look at the first users object in our list of user objects and I look at the dictionary representation to see their attributes, those things are here, right? So site role, email, and so forth. So if you don't have these memorized, you can always check, which attributes are maintained for each of those objects. All right, so now we have our data frame, right? So we have a data frame containing the favorites for that particular category and user. What we need to do so that this data frame doesn't get overwritten without saving it somewhere on each iteration, I need to actually, let me come up here and create a list of data frames that we're going to append to. So I'm going to create an empty list, initialize that list. And what I'm going to do down here is I'm going to say all favorites dot append category favorites. Okay, so this is going to ensure that for each iteration, so for each user and category combination, that I'm not creating a data frame and then simply, doing all this heavy lifting and then overwriting it, right? I'm going to take all of this hard work, the result of this data frame. I'm going to then append that to a list of data frames. So let's take a look at this. So if I run this, and if I actually put this in the right spot, not in the right spot, it is favorite project ID. What did I type wrong here? Project name. Oh, okay. Gosh, got me there. So project name. That's a result of copy and pasting and not being too aware. All right. All right, now let's look at our all favorites. Makes no sense to us because, well, it's a list of data frames. But let's look at the first data frame. Okay, this looks a lot better. This looks meaningful, looks like something we can use. All right, so we have a data frame that looks like it's tied to the first user. So the first user, so the first iteration and the first category type. So in this case, it happened to be data sources. So we have a data frame for this user containing their data source favorites. So there's 3 favorites, so there's 3 rows. Now, we're gonna have a bunch of these data frames, right? We're gonna have one data frame per user, per favorite category. So data sources, workbooks, flows, etc. If they have favorites, right? So let's just say both users have favorites for data sources, workbooks, and flows. There's going to be 6 data frames. There's 2 users, there's 1 data frame per favorite type. That's not going to be the case here, right? Because we already checked and we saw that there were, among these 2 users, there were some differences in what each user has favorited in terms of types and content. All right, so the next thing we want to do here is, obviously, we can't leave it like this, right? We can't just leave it as a list of data frames. What we want to do is we want to take this list of data frames and create a report. So let's just go ahead and type that down here. Create a data frame containing favorite information. This is going to be our master data frame, right? It's going to be our favorites report. And to do this, we're going to concatenate all those data frames in that list using Pandas' concat method. And I'm just going to say all favorites. Again, this is a list of data frames. The axis I'm going to concatenate on, I'm just going to append them to one another, right? So I'm going to, in SQL, that's a union. Excel, that's you taking a pre-existing data range or a worksheet and appending to it. So I'm going to say axis is equal to 0. And then I'm going to ignore the index. I'm just going to have that restart each time, or not restart each time. I'm going to have it go from 0 to n. Put that as true. And then if we run this, let's just take a look at it. We're going to do some transformations here in a moment to make this look prettier. Let's just take a look at what we got. All right, so now we have an extended data frame, a single data frame that contains all of the favorites per user. So we have data sources, flows, projects, data sources, flows, workbooks, right? So this is super useful, right? The favorite category, we're able to differentiate one favorite from another in terms of category or type because we captured that. We captured that here. Okay, so a few of the things that I want to do here that make sense to me is let's go ahead and drop this, right? So the only reason we had this in the beginning was because we wanted to take this object, right? This object here. We wanted to extract all of its attribute values and represent those as columns. So individual rows within columns. Let's go ahead and do that now. We're going to go ahead and drop that. So I'm going to just go say, let's just chain this and say drop, and then say columns equal, and we'll say favorites. Right? If I run this, now we don't have that. The next thing I want to do, and this next step, completely optional, I want to make every one of these column names report friendly, right? Plain English report friendly. So what I'm going to do, you may do this a little bit differently, but I'm going to use rename. And I'm going to say for each column dot replace. And what am I going to replace? I'm going to replace these pesky underscores, right? So the underscores are the result of using this Lambda strategy, right? I can't put like favorite ID here. It doesn't work that way, unfortunately. So I settled for underscores, and now I need to undo that, right? I need to make these report friendly. So I'm going to replace the underscores, and I'm going to replace those with a space because that's where they would be, right? I'm going to keep the words separated and replace this with a space. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to say .title. So why am I going to say .title? Well, I want the first character of each word to be capitalized. And then I'm going to replace, now this is probably something, this is maybe a little bit overkill, but I'm going to do it because it would bother me if I generated reports and I saw ID with one lowercase character and one uppercase character. So I say .id, and I'm going to say, let's replace that with capitalize I, capitalize D. All right. So again, this is just saying for each column in this data frame, replace underscore if there is one with space, change each column to title case, and replace ID, so capital I, lowercase d, with ID if this series of characters is present in the column name. All right, and let's actually need to say axis 1, so we're doing that along the columns. Let's run this, and then let's look at our beautiful data frame. All right, so now this looks a lot better, right? This looks report ready. It looks like it's ready to be able to give to your consumers. We have pretty column names. We have great data. The only thing we're missing here now is how do we get this to people, right? It doesn't make much sense or there's not much use of it just sitting here in my IDE all to myself, right? So I need to get it out of this editor. So let's go ahead and write this to an Excel report. And this is actually going to be a favorites report to the data frame. So let's go ahead and write this. What I'm going to do is I'm going to copy and paste 2 blocks of code or 2 steps of code that I use for all of these tutorials and just for all of this report generation. This is my go-to strategy for writing this to an Excel file. I'll explain what's going on here in just a moment. All right, so this first step here, I'm going to use pathlib to create a path object. And if I scroll up here, you may have been wondering, beginning of this video, why does he have pathlib? Well, that's because I'm using it to create a path object. User-friendly way of doing that. And the path I'm going to write to is I'm going to actually spell this right. Just notice I spelled that wrong, so let's do favorites. I'm writing to a folder, tutorial 11, within my Tableau Server Client folder, and I'm going to create or write to a path called favorites report, and it's going to be appended with the date and time for which this report was generated or this code block was executed. The reason this is important is because you're going to run this code more than once over the lifetime of administrating your server or just running these reports in general. You don't want to overwrite to pre-existing reports, and this also helps you distinguish one report from another. Say I run a report this week, next week, the following week, I will be able to differentiate those reports based on the date and time that is appended to the file name. All right, so the file name is favorites report, and it's appended by the date and time for which this block or code is executed. And what am I going to do? I'm going to write that. So I'm going to write my favorites report to an Excel workbook using this writer object, and the sheet name is going to be favorites. So if you don't put this in here, if you just leave it as a default, it's going to be sheet 1 like it typically would be in Excel. And index is equal to false. Why do I do this? Well, I do not care about this supplementary index here, right? It doesn't add any value to me in Excel. Excel already has a great built-in row numbering system that starts with 1. So I don't need this. It's superfluous, right? It doesn't add any value. So I'm going to say false. Let's not keep that. Let's go ahead and write this file. And what I'll do, let's go ahead and pull this up so let's see the fruit of our labor here. All right, so here's our favorites reports. As expected, there's 1 row per favorite. And captured within each of those rows is the favorite ID, the name of the favorite, the category of the favorite, so is it a data source, flow, workbook, metric, etc. The project ID corresponding to the favorite, to the item, the project name, and then the user information. So this is going to be the user that has favorited that item. So in this case, it's me, the email address, the site role. Let's now jump over to Tableau Server to confirm that our report is working as intended. And this is exactly, so favorite for favorites corresponding to the front end of Tableau Server. So jump over there now. here's my Tableau server. I'm signed in. And to navigate to my favorites, so this is going to, having things favorited, is going to allow me to easily get to the things that I find most important. So in this case, I have a project called North America Sales that I favorited, a flow called North America Sales, bridge enabled, and a few data sources, right? So I have 5 items here that have been favorited by me. And if I go back to our Excel spreadsheet, we're going to see these 5 items. So these 5 items tied to the first user in this Excel worksheet. So let's go ahead and switch back. And what I'll do is I'm just going to filter this. It looks like they're already in desirable order, but we'll do it anyways. So we have the project that we saw previously. We have the flow and those 3 data sources. And that's our favorites report. So that wraps up this video on generating a favorites report. I hope you found this tutorial useful and can use the concepts I've covered to level up your ability to manage your own Tableau server through automation.
If you enjoyed this video, then please like the video and subscribe to my channel for notifications on future videos. Thank you again, and see you next time.